Misery is manifold. The wretchedness of earth is multiform. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow, its hues as various as the hues of that arch, as distinct too, yet as intimately blended. Overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. How is it that from beauty I have derived a type of unloveliness? From the covenant of peace, a simile of sorrow. But as, in ethics, evil is a consequence of good, so in fact, out of joy is sorrow born. Either the memory of the past bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which have their origin in ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Agus. That of my family I will not mention. Yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than my gloomy gray hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the characteristic of the family manor, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in the armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very particular nature of the library's contents. There is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber and with its volumes, of which latter I will say no more. Here died my mother, herein I was born. But it is mere idleness to say that I had not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it. Let us not argue the matter. Convinced myself, I seek not to convince. There is, however, a resemblance of aerial forms, of spiritual in meaning eyes, of sounds, musical yet sad, a remembrance which will not be excluded, a memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too, in the impossibility of my getting rid of it while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber I was born, thus awaking from a long night of what seemed, but was not, non-entity, at once into the very region of the fairyland, into the place of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thought and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I loitered away my boyhood in books and dissipated my youth in reverie. But it is singular that as years rolled away and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers, it is wonderful what stagnation fell thereupon and springs of my life. Wonderful how total and inversion took place in the character of my commonest thoughts. The realities of the world affected me as visions, and as visions only. The wild ideas of land and dreams became in turn not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls. Yet differently we grew. I ill of health and buried in gloom, she agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers the ramble on the hillside, mine the study of the cloister. I living within my own heart and addicted body and soul to the most intense and painful meditation. She roaming carelessly through life with no thought of shadow in her path, or the silent flight of raven-winged hours. Berenice, I called upon her name. Berenice, And from the gray ruins of memory, 1,000 tumultuous recollections are started at the sound. Ah, vividly her image before me now, as in the early days of her lightheartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous, yet fantastic beauty. O sylph amid the shrubberies of Arnheim. O naiad amongst its fountains. And then all is mystery and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like a simoon upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervaded her mind, her habits, her character, and in a manner most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person. Alas, the destroyer came and went, and the victim, where was she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the primary train of maladies superinduced by that fatal and primary one which effected a revolution so horrible of a kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing and obstinate in nature, a species of epilepsy, not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was, in most instances, startlingly abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by another appellation, my own disease, then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomaniac character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at the length of obtaining over me the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I must term it so, consisted in a morbid irritability of those properties of the mind in medical sciences termed attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear in general that it is in no manner possible to convey to the mind of the mere reader an adequate idea of the nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the powers of meditation busied and buried themselves in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. To muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin, or in the typography of a book, to become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadow falling aslant upon the tapestry, or upon the door, to lose myself for an entire night in watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over the perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased, to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obstinately preserved in. Such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries induced by the condition of mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to anything like analysis or explanation. Yet let me not be misapprehended. The undue, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with that ruminating propensity common to all mankind, and more especially indulged in by persons of ardent imagination. It was not even, as might first be supposed, an extreme condition, or an exaggeration of such propensity, but primarily and essentially distinct and different. In the one instance, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object not usually frivolous, imperceptibly loses sight of the object in the wilderness of deductions and suggestions issuing therefrom, until, at the conclusion of the daydream, often replete with luxury, he finds the incitamentum, or first cause, of his musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming through the medium of my distempered vision and refracted an unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and those few pertinaciously returning in upon the original object as the center. The meditations were never pleasurable, and at the termination of the surface, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained that supernaturally exaggerated interest which was prevailing feature of the disease. In a word, the powers of mind more particularly exercised were with me, as I have said before, the attentive, and are, with the daydream, the speculative. Thus, it would appear, shaken from its balance only by trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken of Ptolemy Hephaestion, which, steadily resisting the attack of human violence and the fiercer fury of water and wind, trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear a matter beyond doubt that the alteration produced by her unhappy malady in the moral condition of Berenice would affect me many objects for the exercise of that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble explaining. Yet such was not in any degree the case. In the lucid intervals of my infirmity, her calamity indeed gave me pain, and, taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her fair and gentle life, I did not fail to ponder frequently and bitterly upon the wonder-working means by which so strange a revolution had been so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook none of the idiosyncrasies of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under circumstances to the ordinary mass of mankind. True to its own character, my disorder revealed in less important but more startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, in the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightest days of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I had never loved her. In the strange anomaly of my existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and my passions always were of the mind. Through the gray of early morning, along the trellised shadows of the forest at noonday, and in the silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I had seen her, not as a living, breathing Berenice, but as Berenice of a dream. Not as a being of earthy, but as the abstraction of such a being. Not as a thing to admire, but to analyze. Not as an object of love, but as a theme of the most abstruse, although desultory speculation. And now I shudder in her presence, and grew pale at her approach. Yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition, I called to mind that she had loved me long. And in an evil moment, I spoke to her of marriage. And at length, the period of our nuptials was approaching, when, upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of those unseasonably warm, calm, and misty days which are the nurse of beautiful Halcyon, I sat, as I thought, alone, in the inner apartment of the library. But uplifting my eyes, I saw Berenice stood before me. Was it my own excited imagination, or the misty influences of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the gray draperies which fell around her figure, that caused its so vacillating and indistinct outline? I could not tell. She spoke no word, and I, not for worlds, could have uttered a single syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. A sense of insufferable anxiety oppressed me, and consuming curiosity pervaded my soul. And sinking back upon my chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. Alas, its emaciation was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in any single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon her face. The forehead was high and very pale, and singularly placid, and once jetty of hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples and innumerable ringlets now of vivid yellow, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with reigning melancholy of countenance. The eyes were lifeless, lusterless, seemingly pupilless. I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare in the contemplation of this thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile of particular meaning, the teeth of Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I had never seen them, or that having done so, I had died. The shutting of the door disturbed me, and looking up, I found that my cousin had departed from the chamber. But from the discorded chamber of my mind had not, alas, departed, and would not be driven away. The white and ghastly spectrum of the teeth, not a speck on their surface, not a shade on their enamel, not an indenture in their edges, but what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand upon my memory. I saw them now, even more unequivocally than I had before then. The teeth, they were here and there and everywhere, and visibly and palpably before me, long, narrow, excessively white, with pale lips writhing about them, and is the very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania, and I struggled in vain against its strangeness and irresistible influence. In the multiplied objects of the external world, I had no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I longed with a frenzied desire. All other matters and all different interests became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their sole individuality, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light. I turned them in every attitude. I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon their peculiarities. I pondered upon their conformation. I mused upon the alteration in their nature. I shuddered as I assigned to them an imagination, sensitivity, and sentient power, and even, when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expression. Yes, here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Des indes. Therefore, it was that I coveted them so madly. I felt that their possession could alone ever restore me to peace in giving back my reason. And the evening closed in upon me thus, and then the darkness came and tarried and went, and the day again dawned. and the mists of the second night were now gathering around. And still I sat motionless in that solitary room, and still I sat buried in meditation, and still the phantasma of the teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy as, with most vivid and hideous distinction, it floated about amid the changing lights and shadows of the chamber. At length there broke in upon my dreams a cry of horror and dismay, and thereunto, after a pause, succeeded the sound of troubled voices, intermingling with many low moanings of sorrow or of pain. I arose from my seat. Throwing open one of the doors of the library, I saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She had been seized with epilepsy in the early morning, and now, at the closing in of night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all the preparations for burial were completed. I found myself sitting in the library, and again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and excited dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replaced with horror. Horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terribly from ambiguity. It was a fearful page in the record of my existence, written all over with dim, hideous, and unintelligible recollections. I strived to decipher them, but in vain, while ever and anon, like the spirit of a departed sound, the shrill, piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I had done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it lay a little box. It was of no remarkable character. I had seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it there, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were in no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, into a sentence underscored therein. The words were singular but simple ones of the poem Ibn Zayd. Why then, as I pursue them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on end, and the blood from my body become congealed within my veins? There came a light tap at the library door, and pale as the tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulous, husky, and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He told of a wild cry disturbing the silence of the night, of the gathering together of the household, of a search in the direction of the sound, and then his tones grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered to me of a violated grave, of a disfigured body enshrouded, yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to my garments. They were muddy and clotted with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand. It was indented with the impress of human nails. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some time. It was a spade. With a shriek, I bounded from the table and grasped the box that lay upon it. But I could not force it open, and in my tremor it slipped from my hands and fell heavily, burst into pieces, and from it, with rattling sounds, There rolled out some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small, white, ivory-looking substances that were scattered about the floor to and fro.